Good morning. A very warm welcome to everyone for the third day of Bruegel annual meetings. My name is Zsolt Darvas. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm very honored to chair our discussion on the surge of inequality after COVID. And we have an excellent panel. Let me briefly introduce them. Santina Bertulessi is the deputy head of cabinet of Nicolas Schmit, who is the European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. She's joining remotely. Then next to me in the Bruegel office, we have Philippe Lamberts, member of the European Parliament. He is now currently having his third term as a member of the Parliament. And last but not least, Martin Sandbu, the European economics commentator of Financial Times, who very frequently writes on topics related to our discussion today. So the discussion now is about inequality in the aftermath of COVID-19. And first of all, we have to discuss, and we will discuss, what are the more general views of inequality. I think inequality has many different aspects. Most people talk about income inequality, but there are equally important aspects, for example, health inequality. Statistical data shows, for example, that people who have lower income, they have 5 times higher unmet medical needs than people having higher income. There is also a very sad statistics suggesting that people with lower income live approximately 10 years shorter than people having higher income. So health inequality is also an absolutely important issue. And for example, yesterday, Tito Bori at the session on the future of work here at Bruegel annual meetings noted very wisely that those people who have a higher health risk, they also typically have a higher risk of losing their jobs. So the two things, health and employment prospects, are very strongly correlated. But there are also many other important aspects, for example, gender or the equal opportunities for disabled people. So there are many important issues on income inequality. And we also would like to ask our audience a very first question, which we will, the results we will discuss later, namely that how they see the various forms of inequality in the European Union in 2021. We set the date 2021 because even though this panel is about inequality after the pandemic, but unfortunately at this stage we do not know when after the pandemic will come. In an optimistic scenario, sometime next year we might get over it, but in a more pessimistic scenario, unfortunately the pandemic might stay with us for many years to come. So our question is that next year, when we already will have the first impact of economic and social impact of the pandemic, so how our audience see various kinds of inequalities, be they income, be they health, be they gender, be they wealth, be there any other. Sometimes during our discussion, we will come back to the view of the audience. But now let me turn our panelists. And before discussing the impact of the pandemic, let's have a quick round for all three of them with a very simple question. So how do you see the importance of inequalities in the European Union before the pandemic? And again, you can say about many different aspects, income, health, wealth, and many others. And also we can take also a more global perspective. So how important this problem is, should it be or had to be on top priority, or we can be more or less reassured that income inequality in the European Union is generally much lower than, let's say, in the United States or in many advanced countries. So let's start discussing what was the situation before the pandemic, and then we will discuss the impact of the pandemic. So I ask our speakers to initially give their remarks in an alphabetic order. So first, Santina Bertolessi, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jules. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting exchange on a topic which is very, very at the heart of not only the current crisis, but of the developments of our economy and economies and society. As you rightly said, it's important to have a view on what the situation of the picture was before the outburst of the COVID-19 crisis. And whether we can say, taking a global view, as you also said, that Europeans are nowadays better educated, healthier, live longer, and has more prosperous lives than any time in point in the past. We know that these achievements do not obscure the large disparities and inequalities which exist. And when we talk about inequalities, as you rightly pointed out, we do not only have to focus on income or wealth inequalities, but on inequalities of opportunities, because it's about breaking the cycles of intergenerational poverty and inequalities and being able to ensure social progress, which is one of the main goals that the Union should pursue. Looking at Europe, also having in mind that, as you said, clearly, the model of development that and the welfare state that the European Union is a champion of can only resist and continue if we can ensure social progress. And if we look at the situation before the crisis, we have also interesting data produced by GRC just before, and looking also the semester, we can at least say, looking at income, that already the richest 20% of households in Europe is on average 5 times higher than the poorest 20%. In certain member states, 8 times higher. And the growing, we have experienced growing disparities on multiple socioeconomic dimensions, following, of course, to the financial crisis. And the key is that this has fueled the sense of unfairness and discontent all over Europe, because the financial crisis had already reinforced pre-existing socioeconomic divides. The vulnerable groups, those with a low level of education, with low-skilled workers, or with migrant backgrounds, have largely been hit by the consequences of the downturn and the austerity programs. That's why the inequalities have been growing in a much more strong manner in southern Europe. As you were saying, we really have to be able to look at the issues of equal opportunities, and it's clearly important, as I said, to be able to intervene and break the intergenerational cycle of inequalities. If we look at data, we can see that inequalities are passed across generations. If we look at a child who is born from a parent with tertiary degree, he has on average 43% likelihood, is 33% times likelier to have a degree than a child born on from a household without tertiary education. And if we enlarge the scope of the analysis and go to grandparents, we see that this goes beyond 50%. So as I said here, as you were mentioning, health inequalities, I think that education inequalities and unequal access to inequalities is key. And I was mentioning the possibilities of access to education to children, because there, in my view, it's really the beginning of the cycle of inequalities and poverties, where we should be able at European level and national level to take concrete actions. And so we have seen and we've said that given the fact that we all member states and the EU is giving a role of coordination, have developed, though in an uneven manner, their policy, and they deployed the social protection system in reactions to the previous crisis. We are stressing the importance of equal opportunities. For instance, for us, especially when I say for us now, I'm talking about our cabinet, my commissioner, also the adoption of the European Pillar of Social Rights and its implementation is a key. It's our compass, is the key compass to tackle the inequalities. But we cannot forget that if we look at welfare and if we look at the sustainability of welfare, we cannot ignore tax policies, because tax policies are key in tackling those inequalities. For instance, concentrating on wealth inequalities and not only on income inequalities. We can really discuss if given all the differences that exist in the member states, if the current very low redistributive effect of wealth taxes is going to be sustainable. Let's say that this was the scenario that we have found that we had already before the crisis. And inequalities it's a problem not only because it's unfair, it's a problem because it's a break on the resilience and the inclusiveness of our socioeconomic models, but it's also fueling the strong and growing mistrust of our citizens towards institutions, towards politics in general, at national and European level. And it's also, in the long term, a possible threat to the sustainability of our democratic political systems. It cannot be underestimated. And it's really a key issue now that we talk about developing national plans and European approach to tackle the recovery and resilience. And if we want to build resilient system, if we want systems which aim at higher socioeconomic convergence, then we have to intervene on inequalities strongly. Of course, maybe we tackle afterwards the consequences of the so how the COVID impacted on this. Clearly, employment.
Yes, so I suggest to discuss the COVID impact in the second round. So maybe let me now pass to Mr. Lambert, but I really appreciate your very broad overview, in particular highlighting many different dimensions of inequalities, including the intergenerational nature, the impact on or the crucial role of education and inclusive health policies. I think tax issues that you raise are very, very prominent, and we will surely come back to this issue when we will discuss various policy measures. But now let's hear from Mr. Lamberts. What's your view on the state of inequality in the EU before COVID?
Well, I've been looking at the dynamics and basically the evolution that we've seen has corresponded to my professional life. I entered the labor market in the late 80s, and I've seen the impact of the hegemony of a certain school of economics, basically the Chicago school, that has led us to where we are. I mean, you know, inequality does not come out of nowhere. It's the result of choices. And of course, neoliberals would say individual choices, as if system choices do not matter. But indeed, when you practice supply-side economics, that you disinvest public services, that basically your obsession is to put taxation, social protection systems in competition with one another, a competition which is arbitrated by the so-called investors, that is the rent seekers, you shouldn't be surprised that indeed you push for tax reforms that favor the rich, but this is, I would say, exposed distribution policies, but the ex-ante policies are affecting inequality as well. Because if you structure the labor market in a way that you put under pressure the lowest salaries, then of course you will drive revenues, well, income at the bottom end of the spectrum down, while you are pushing incomes at the upper end of the spectrum up because of your choices. I mean, the kind of globalization that we have chosen is producing that kind of impact. Deregulation and the withdrawal from the state from very important areas, be them education, be them healthcare, housing, well, basically drives up inequality. And so we have had that kind of policies, and of course it started at different times in different areas of Europe and the world, but basically the turn was made at the beginning of the 80s, and then this agenda was adopted, culminating with the adoption of that agenda, of course, here in Brussels, and especially in the European Commission. But of course, there was always a majority in the Council and Parliament to support that. So that is the broad context. And then at the beginning of the notice, and I would say that culminated, well, I would say, no, of the 2010s, after the global financial crisis, inequality became a discussion item. Before, forget about this. This was not even mentioned. And of course, Piketty played a role in that, but focusing very much on income inequality and wealth inequality, whereas, as you very rightly pointed out, there's many other forms of inequalities. So let's say that at least a public conversation started on the issue of inequality, or I would rather say exclusion, because actually you have increasingly a division in our societies, a polarization, which in a way explains also the polarization in the political landscape between the haves and the have-nots, but also the people who feel part of the system and those who don't. And to me, the Gilets jaunes or the Black Lives Matter movement are just examples of that, of people saying, well, actually, it's like I don't belong to this society any longer. So it's not just a matter of income, because many of the Gilets jaunes, for instance, are people at work. They have a job, but their job does not allow them to make ends meet. They can't live close to their job because simply many places become totally unaffordable for people to live. And so they have to live in places that are either remote or polluted, for instance, which has a health impact. I remember discussion with Gilets jaunes from the industrial suburbs of Marseille to that extent. And what I mean is that we had those policies without questioning their distributional impact, and then we started having a discussion, and then, bam, COVID hit. So immediately, quite obviously, COVID hits in a context where, well, at least there's consciousness in political circles that, well, maybe something should be done. But again, it's just consciousness, because if you look at the actual policies, and Macron is a good example, all these reforms have been supply-side reforms favoring basically the so-called investors. And actually, the assumption there is the trickle-down economics that has never existed. I mean, make the rich richer does not make society better and does not improve the fate of everyone. So actually, we have trickle-up economics. And I may finish with that because we will discuss the COVID impact afterwards. But actually, how should I say, if you believe that, that indeed favoring the investor is the right thing to do, often you end up in a place where you substitute, or should I say, a competitive market economy with actually a rent extraction system. And that's what we have right now. And when you are in a rent extraction system where basically those who are in a too big to fail not just company, but position, are basically allowed to extract a rent. And I'll finish with this. I once had a discussion that was back in time when we were discussing bankers' bonuses. I will never forget that, in London. And of course, I was just facing a bunch of traders who was just mad at me. And I asked them, just imagine that someday you have cancer and you end up in a hospital. What will be the value to you of the work of the nurse that will care for your well-being, or at least limiting damage and making sure that you can go through this period in the least uncomfortable way? And now question yourself, what is the value of your work to her? And look at the income differential between the two. That tells me something, is that, well, actually, we have increasingly people who are in a rent extraction situation. They are basically given a license to take value away from society instead of being forced to get an income by providing value to society. And that's the big divide that we have. Now, will COVID help overcoming this? That's the several billion-dollar question.
Now, we will discuss that later, but let me have a very quick follow-up. Comparing Europe, let's say, to US or other parts of the world. Because you rightly say that rent extraction and disinvestment in public services is a major threat to the well-being of,
it's a reality.
Of most. It's a reality, yes. But in Europe, we always had a focus on what we also call a social market economy. If you look at the share of public spending and social protection spending, it's so much higher than elsewhere in the world.
Course.
We also have, now the European Pillar of Social Rights, and before we had other instruments. So do you think that the rent extraction problem equally applies to Europe and, let's say, other advanced countries, or does Europe better in some sense?
Yeah, of course. If you may always find a worse place, and there's worse places. I'm glad to be a European. No doubt about that. Absolutely no doubt. And I prefer to be a citizen of Belgium under Belgian social security than under Hungarian or Polish social security. Of course. But, does that, well, will that help when you have a gilet jaune in front of you to say, well, in the US, it is much worse? They don't care. They feel excluded in the place where they live. They don't care that the situation is worse elsewhere. And of course, that argument has been used saying, well, it could be worse, so keep quiet. But it is not an argument. And of course, European Pillar of Social Rights, this is all nice and well. Again, this is not hard law. Well, deregulation of the financial markets is hard law, right? Tax competition is hard law. Free trade agreements are hard law. European Pillar of Social Rights is declarations. Well, there's a few bits and pieces. But the thing is that, well, it's like fighting climate change. You may say, okay, now let's spend 20 or 25 or 30% of the budget to fighting climate change. First, I don't know how you measure that, but okay, let's assume we are serious. But if you keep with the other 75 or 70% of your budget worsening climate change, what's the point? What's the point? For one step forward, you will make 3 steps backwards. And that's the thing. I mean, if we say, okay, now we won't discuss, and Macron, again, is a very good example, because he's the one who will not question his supply-side reforms, and then says, well, now I have the gilet jaune, I have to give something just to keep peace in my country, but I will not question the causes, the root causes that lead us there. So I will not question my economic policies that drive up inequality, but then every now and then I will be forced to give a few billion just to remove people from the streets. But, well, I'd rather have a system that both ex ante and ex post produces, by design, inclusion.
Thanks very much. In the second part of our discussion, we will discuss what policy measures would be needed, both at the national and European levels. And I would very much look forward to also hearing you and also the other panelists' view on what should be the right course of action. But now let's turn to Martin. So, Martin, how do you assess the pre-COVID European situation in terms of various inequalities?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. A lot of very good points have been made, so I'll be very concise. Let me make 3 points. First, and this addresses some of what you were discussing right before. Let's be clear that Europe has done better than the US in terms of inequality, and in particular, EU countries on the whole have done better than the kind of Anglo-American economic system, including the UK. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, nevertheless, there are some very serious problems in all European countries to do with inequality, and they're driven by largely the same dynamics as those we see in the US and in the UK. And those dynamics are at the root, they have to do with technological change. Technological change has, over the last 4 decades, have changed our economies in such a way that they've become polarized, a word that already came up. There are, in the most modern sectors, there are good jobs for people like us, people who are well educated, people who could do cognitive work, people who can work in front of screens. But a large group of the population have been, and it's a cliche, but it's the right word, have been left behind. The good jobs for a large group of the population have largely disappeared. We know that the factory jobs disappeared, not because of globalization, but because factories are more automated. You just don't need as many hands to produce manufacturing goods anymore. That's one example. Computers have done for a lot of clerical jobs that are no longer needed. The internet will do the same to retail. Who knows what artificial intelligence will do? These are long-term, unavoidable, really, physical, technological, economic processes. That's the challenge we're all up against. Europe has handled it somewhat better than the US and the UK, but there are big problems in Europe too. And you see that because there are groups of people who are left behind, who don't have good jobs. Paradoxically, even in very rigidly regulated labor market systems, you end up with the same outcome as in the unregulated, flexible UK-US systems, where a lot of people have very precarious jobs, short-term contracts, unpredictable hours, and very low salaries and low job security. Another aspect of this is regional inequality, which I think we really have to talk about. Capital cities have tended to do well because that's where the new industries, the new sectors thrive. And the hinterlands in pretty much every country have lagged behind and fallen behind often. Places that were suitable maybe for factories are not necessarily that suitable for very knowledge-intensive service industries. So the point here is we have the same dynamic that's been driving changes in our economies everywhere since about 1980. It's largely to do with how the structure of our economy changes, not as much about globalization, I don't think. But of course, it is about what policy responses we have come up with or failed to come up with to make those changes work for everyone. Philippe said that there are a lot of people who feel they don't belong. That's a phrase I like very much. That's why I've just written a book called The Economics of Belonging. It's really about trying to put in place the policies that don't stop these technical changes. They bring productivity, which is the root of higher living standards, but that make them work for everyone, that they can include everyone. Third and last point, these inequality driving dynamics have been reinforced by COVID. COVID hits exactly the same people who have already been hit by 4 decades of economic change. People in often low-paid manual services, because that's where you're most exposed to disease and contagion. And it's also the jobs that are most hit by lockdowns. So again, it's the people who already had drawn the shortest straw who are most at risk, both health-wise and in terms of the economic disruption.
Many thanks, Martin, for these 3 very well made good points. And you already started to discuss the impact of COVID on inequalities. So let's continue with that question. Now that we have a view that the situation in Europe, I think it's a shared view among the 3 of you, is certainly better than elsewhere in the world, but it's very far from being satisfactory, even before COVID. Now, let's discuss what do we know already about the impact of COVID on inequalities. I'm afraid we still have to wait quite some time until hard data will come out. Yet there are a couple of research looking at earlier pandemics, which I think uniformly conclude that an epidemic in a country or a pandemic affecting many countries lead to rises in inequality. So that's what we can expect. But what do we know? Is there any more recent information, hard data? And what's your expectation how COVID will impact inequalities, in particularly in Europe? So, Martin, why don't you start this time?
I'll just follow up very briefly. As you say, the sort of proper deep research takes time. But let me just make one point. What we know very well are which sectors are hit the most by COVID. And we know that it's the sectors that involve physical presence and physical interaction: retail, hospitality, tourism. We know that those sectors are hit the most, and we know that people who work in them are therefore most at risk. If there hadn't been for the various furlough, short-time work, support schemes that a lot of countries have put in place, we know that the people who would have been hit in a devastating way would have been people who work in these sectors that are, more unpredictable work, more seasonal work, sometimes more informal, less well-regulated or less well-controlled work, often young people, waiters, shopkeepers, and so on. So, we don't need to know more. We know enough to see where the biggest economic hit is. Now, what we need to find out is how much have the support schemes helped, but importantly also what happens when we come out of lockdown, when those support schemes start to be withdrawn. And very importantly, what we don't know is to what extent can those sectors come back to where they were, and to what extent do we have to find some way of shifting people out of those sectors because they won't thrive as much as they did before, because it's very possible that various restrictions, physical, social distancing, and so on, will be with us indefinitely. So, that's my point about what we know, but that also raises immediately the question of how we probably need to have quite big reallocations in our economies. There won't be as many jobs, and certainly not the same jobs in those sectors as before. So we really have no time to waste in thinking about how, as painlessly as possible, we can help people find jobs elsewhere, and hopefully, ideally, better jobs than what they had before.
Thanks, Martin, very much. Very clear point that indeed we know which sectors were hit and we know the characteristics of workers there. Now, Mr. Lamberts, how do you see inequalities during and after COVID?
Well, first, inequality hit, made probably, how should I say, COVID made some inequalities more visible in the way that, if you are confined, like me, in a big house in Brussels, not in a luxurious neighborhood, but a big one with a small garden, it's not the same, with 5 people, it's not the same thing. If you have a big family in a small apartment with no access to fresh air, I'm afraid there's many people in such conditions in Brussels, and guess who they are? So there are also the people who are doing this manual work of cleaning, in retail, etc. When they have a job. So this has been exacerbated, and especially even if you have temporary unemployment, you benefit from temporary unemployment schemes. Usually, this is not a 100% salary replacement. So if you are already just barely surviving, even having that support is no longer to prevent you from falling into poverty. And then, of course, cramped accommodation makes also for more domestic violence, more difficult living conditions simply. So all these aspects do count, notwithstanding the fact that those who still have work that has to be performed during the confinement are also more exposed to health hazards. So that drives up inequality as well. Now, very much will depend on what we do in terms of policy choices, because Martin, I agree with you that indeed we need to see reallocation. I thought the other day when 1,500 baggage handlers lose their job at the Brussels airport, well, it's quite likely that these jobs will not come back, because air traffic will be impacted in a sustained way, and not just because of COVID, but also because of climate change, and we need to reduce the size of our airline industry. Now, the question is, because I'd like to continue on what Martin said about technological change, because indeed this is a major driver of exclusion. And artificial intelligence may expand into, say, more qualified jobs. I mean, AI may indeed displace jobs that are performed now by university graduates. And there, the real question is what kind of structure we want to see. I do not believe it belongs to the state to decide ex ante, which activity, what shift should be done. I think that we have to set a framework. For instance, if we make air travel more expensive because of climate impact, well, probably air transport will shrink, and if we invest conversely in surface transport, this will expand. Now, and then the shift will happen not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are the current structures, I would say, of the triangle made up of labor market organization, social security systems, and taxation systems, is this the right setting to reduce inequality? And I would hope that COVID will help us have a debate on that. Because the first question I'd like to ask is, when I look at the employment rate that we have, well, this is before COVID, but when you see that the actual, not unemployment rate, but employment rate expressed in full-time equivalents in a country like Germany is around 68% or something, then you find that even in a developed country like Germany, 32% of the workable hours are not worked. Yet, German GDP has been going up significantly, well, at a slow pace, but has been going up since the beginning of the century. Now, that tells you something, that actually, if we define full-time employment like we do, actually, a lot of those theoretically workable hours are not needed. And I would bet that actually, well, one of the books I read over the summer was Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. And of course, this dates back a bit, but it tells something about the reality of work today. There's a lot of useless work that can be eliminated. So is it right to continue claiming that the normal working week is 38 or 35 or 40 hours? Because it has an importance. Because if you define the norm like that, then of course what you create, by definition, is structural unemployment. And if you have structural unemployment, it is very good for those who own capital, but this is very bad for those who don't. So it has an importance, because indeed, and back to what Keynes said back in time about the number of hours we should work to create the goods and services we actually need and want and can afford to live decently on this planet, well, maybe actually we have to rethink the organization of the labor market. But if you do that, then you have to rethink social security. And then you have to rethink taxation as well. And then, indeed, wealth taxation becomes something that you have to seriously consider. Because if, with AI and automation, obviously, the share of capital in the production of goods increases. And that means that the owners of capital enjoy an even better ride than those who don't. So, again, you have to look at system change. And I see no appetite at the moment at that. Now, in the European Commission, they are interested in corporate taxation and making at least corporate taxation a bit fairer, fair enough. There's a real interest there. But the common wisdom is that we shouldn't touch the labor market organization, and if we should touch social security, is to reduce it. And there, if I look at it macroeconomically, I think, well, hang on one second. We generalized social security in the 60s in Belgium, right? And when I look at the per capita wealth of Belgium at that time, and the wealth, the per capita wealth in Belgium today, if we could afford widening social security back then tell me why we can't today. Yeah, but there's global competition. Yeah, but that's a choice. I mean, to basically say that capital can flow freely, that goods can flow freely, that you can have kids producing goods elsewhere in the world and having those goods enter freely the European market, is deciding on your own impotence. You decide to have basically your social security, your social contract dictated by, not by Vietnam, but by the arbitration of global capital. That is the reality. And so we also have to look at this kind of dogma that you cannot control the flows of capital. I'm not saying that capital cannot cross borders. I'm just saying that we have to decide under which conditions it can cross borders. And there, this is a taboo. If you look even at European treaties, it is a taboo by treaty. But this is totally ideological. Why is it that a migrant can cross a border but under very strict conditions, but a Euro can cross borders with no conditions? Tell me. And once you decide that, well, you decide that your policies will be dictated by the owners of capital. And this, sorry, I'm a Democrat, I don't want.
Well, it's really fascinating that you bring such general system change into the discussion. So I would like to elaborate more on this point. So let me now turn to Santina Bertulessi. So maybe we can continue on what Philip Lamberts has just said, and I would like to ask your view on what you see about the future of the European Union, how you see the various discussions about better protecting people inside the European Union, how much we are exposed, for example, to child work, that Mr. Child works elsewhere in the world, that we are just importing goods made in Vietnam by children, which is bad for the children there, also bad for employers in the European Union, because these outside producers might have an unfair advantage. So how do you see the role of these much more bigger issues in ensuring fairness within the European Union?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to go back, if possible, before answering to a specific issue that Philip was raising. And because it is clear that technological change and policy decision answering to those have been the drivers of inequalities. And I agree very much that given that the labor share of income is constantly decreasing, we have challenges in deciding how we redistribute and where we take resources to redistribute. And I agree very much that all the reflections on taxation need to be put at the forefront of our discussion, not for a matter of fairness and tackling inequalities, and for a matter of sustainability and efficiency of the working of our system and our internal market, also vis-a-vis competition from outside external actors and key trading partners, as the issue of reciprocity is key in preserving our system. It's not about putting a brake to globalization or multilateral trade, but it's about ensuring fair condition of this. But going back also to the issue of the fact that the role of work, not only the fact that work has changed its nature, it's changing its nature, and the remuneration of work, it's an issue. As I think that one of the main felt injustices is really in work poverty. It's 1 out of 10 workers is working, get up in the morning, go back home after a working day, and he cannot make ends meet. And we are experiencing this on a wide scale. We understand that the dissatisfaction is growing, and that we have to be able to tackle these in our responses. Now, clearly the effect on unemployment, and which in any case is not only about tackling certain sectors, but having an impact of certain group of populations, and namely young women and children. So now going back to your question, children, yes, because children, it's really the weak element of the long chain of inequalities and poverty. You were mentioning the current situations whereby, given given the terms of trade relations Europe has with other actors, and being our treaties based on the fair trade, and we are open market, we allow circulation of goods where the labor components of such goods might come from children, might come from exploited women work, and where also the carbon blueprint is of course not in line with all the regulation we already have in place and we are aiming at putting in place. So these, of course, the terms of fair competitions at international level are to be tackled and are to be discussed. And I think that there is a growing awareness of this, and the mechanisms that we are discussing for trade and for protections and reactions in regard to unfair trade are key. And I think, and this Mr. Philip might agree, also tackling the issues of public procurement is very important at international level. Having said this, it's clear that this does not have to distract us from the fact that there are a series of measures that we have to take immediately in order to respond to the COVID crisis, because we are seeing the effect of unemployment. And if we look at the figures from Q1 to the Q2 of 2020, notwithstanding the massive use of short-time schemes, which have been key in mitigating the crisis, we have experienced the sharpest increase in unemployment of the 90s of our statistics. And according also to some estimates from GRC, we see that even with the mitigating measures taken by the different member states, even here in uneven matters, because I agree with Martin that we have to look at the regional disparities, we see that the impact on disposable household income will be at around 4%, considering all the transfer and considering also the role played by automatic stabilizers. And then we know that automatic stabilizers work very differently from member state to member states and from regions to regions. So this is clear, an issue that we have to tackle now. If we look also at the number of restructuring cases already registered by Eurofund this year, we understand that especially in the sectors mentioned both by Martin and Philip, we know very well that a lot of jobs are distracted due to in a way, COVID has accelerated structural changes that would have anyway occurred on the market. And how do we respond to that? I think that we need to respond to that by creating the opportunities and using the challenges and also all the financement we are putting forward with the Recovery and Resilience Facility to tackle transitions towards digital and green, more green societies. And we have also to focus a lot on skills and education, because this is key. If we want to shift and we have to create new jobs, even with new patterns, and with the issue also of increasing the employment rate. And I agree with Philip that when you look at the level of employment rate, you see that even in very well-performing economies and societies, you are confronted with situations whereby, for instance, female participation to the labor market is too low, and this is a driver also of inequalities, because given also the demographic challenges and the demographic shifts in our societies, we know that inequality hit hard in single parent families. And in this regard, we have to be ready to really focus and put all the necessary resources on skilling and reskilling and on education. And here we have to break the cycle of inequalities of opportunities. Who's going to pay for the reskilling of the workers who are to move from one sector to another, or who are to, if not moving from sectors to anyway change the way the work is to be organized? And this is a question. Is this a cost, which is actually an investment because it's a social investment, that all has to be borne all entirely by public institutions, by all our welfare system, or does this need to be shared differently? Tackling also the uneven distribution of benefits, as Philip was highlighting before. And then if we look at the impact on income, it's clear that we have to say that social investment in terms of crisis is key. So the message from at European level should be and has to be in this juncture when we are supposed to assist member states in developing national plans to tackle the recovery with a view to resilience. We have to clearly say and give support in a way that the plans that we consider to be those looking forward in terms of resilience is those who look at creating jobs, quality jobs, and creating all the necessary conditions to give the necessary financing and investment in social services, because social services, access to education, access to health, access to skilling and reskilling, is the key with which we can accompany the transformations that are taking place and were taking place even before the COVID. So now there is even much more urgency. And in a way, if we do not understand this now, given the urgency and the fact that it's clear to all that the impact of the COVID is only regressive, is only hardly hitting even more the vulnerable households, vulnerable individuals. So it's now the moment to react. And that's why, and in this, I would really stress, I do not totally agree with Philip, that the pillar of social rights is just principles, because it's about translating the principles, concrete measures like minimum wage, minimum income, child guarantee, youth guarantee, investing where it is necessary is the only way to go forward. It's about, of course, political will. And I think that here we have to count on the role of the institutions, and we have to really take the silence which comes from our public opinion. If you look at Eurostat, you see that more than 80% of our citizens perceives inequalities as not only unfairness, and perceives inequality as an unjustifiable break to the development of society, and almost more than 40% believe that they are discriminated and don't have fair access to society, access to decent life, so participation in society. As we said, it's about participating economy and participating society. So I would say, yes, there is the global dynamics that we need to tackle, but these shouldn't distract us from doing what we have to do right now. And if we look, for instance, of the success of certain schemes, like short-time schemes, and the fact that these are investments, because the cost of the short-time schemes is lower than the cost of unemployment. And this is proved. Each a percentage point of public finances put to cover short-time schemes or similar schemes is less costly than the one put in terms of less revenue and cost due to short employment. But here again, we have to think how the system we have in place are apt to cover atypical workers, workers who are outside standard contracts. And here is the challenge to represent those who are not represented. If we look at Eurofund figures, we see that member states have taken hundreds of new measures, and only around 50% of those new measures and policies taken has been adopted by consulting social partners. So there is also an issue of how we represent workers, how workers are represented, how the voice and workers' rights are represented in these shifts towards a new pattern of work, and with a view to see if there is a matching between our social protection systems and the real needs highlighted by the crisis and by previous underlying transitions.
So thanks very much. I see a disagreement between you and Mr. Lamberts. Now we have only 7 minutes left. Mr. Lamberts would like to respond, but I ask you just
what you said about
European please.
Pillar of social rights. All the things that you mentioned are not yet there. So I will believe it when I see it, but not before. Second, on the free trade deals, sorry to say that Hogan now is left, but was against the idea of making social and environmental norms binding and enforceable in free trade deals. We just ratified Vietnam. No enforceable social and environmental norms. So no, the DNA of the trade policy remains unchanged, and your approach to labor market is still the same. So basically, if people don't have a job, it's because they don't have the right skills. I'm not saying that there's no effort to be spent on upskilling people, but you will not tackle mass unemployment with that, because that would mean that actually all this unemployment is caused by are jobs that are out there to be taken, but actually we don't have the people to take them. Yes, there's some jobs that are unfilled because of lack of resources, but this is just a tiny part of the whole unemployment problematic. So again, you have to look at the structure of the labor market instead of saying, well, basically it's the own people's responsibility to find a job and to skill themselves.
Now, I'm sure we could continue this debate, but I would also like to ask some of the questions which were posed by our audience. But before that, let's just quickly look at the results of our poll. So the question was that how serious inequality will be in the European Union in 2021. And as you can see, more than half of participants believe that it will be very serious. So extremely serious was the most, extreme view. Very serious is the second in terms of seriousness. And nobody believes that it will be not serious. So I think our audience indeed agrees with you that there is a lot to do in Europe. And now we have also received many, many questions via Slido. And let me pick one which relates to taxation, and first let me turn to Martin. There is a question which says that if we want to achieve equal opportunities, then if we continue to focus on income taxes as opposed to wealth taxes, then the situation would just be preserved. So Martin, how do you see any change or desirable change or possible change in taxation to foster fairness and lower inequalities?
Well, I think we need to shift the burden of taxation from labor to capital, so labor income in particular. And it's not just the income tax; it's the payroll taxes, the social charges, and so on. The labor tax wedge, the difference between what the employer pays and what the employee takes home, that should go down. Not just in order to lighten that tax burden, but to make it easier, to make it smoother, to change jobs, to make employers more willing to hire, to get this move from worse jobs to better jobs. It's not very well known, but the two countries in the EU that have the highest rate of job churn, of job-to-job moves, are Sweden and Denmark. And that's how they get highly productive jobs. To make up for that sort of tax cuts, you should tax capital instead, and specifically you should tax it on wealth rather than capital income, I think. So I'm very much in favor of a net wealth tax on the model that Switzerland has. And we're out of time, so I'll just say that. Adopt a net wealth tax in every European country.
As I see, Mr. Lamberts agree. Now, the most, basic criticism about wealth tax is that may lead to basically mobility, that people would move their wealth out of jurisdictions which are low taxed.
Well, you should tax on the basis of where the wealth owners are and what citizenship they have.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's again, it's basically yourself putting yourself in a prison saying, well, there's an unwritten rule. It's like physics and gravity and thermodynamics. Capital must be able to flow freely. No, sorry. If you want to live in a rule of law regime, then capital should not be exempt from obeying the law. And I'm very glad that nowadays money is not escaping places in suitcases. And we should, by the way, forbid 200 and 500 euros banknotes, because that still makes that possibility. It flows through electronic circuits. And the NSA knows very well, and all the secret services know very well that, well, you can follow electronic transmission. So, sorry. And ultimately, these guys want to use their money. And if you want to use it, at some point in time, it comes to the surface. So no, I will never accept the argument that, well, people will relocate. What I note is that Russian oligarchs want to live in Europe, right? And even all oligarchs want to live in Europe. Well, if they want to live here, they have to obey the law. And that means paying their taxes. And if they don't, they go to jail, period.
And let me ask a last question, also related to taxation. So someone asked how important the fight against tax evasion in fostering lower inequalities. So what's your view on that? I mean, there are many efforts at the European level, also at global level, to fight tax evasion. What's your view on that? Who would like to? Yeah, Martin, please.
I think it's hugely important, not always because the amounts may make a huge difference to a large group of people. You can take a lot from the very rich that isn't being paid at the moment, and you should. That doesn't mean you equalize everything. But also because the existence of evasion, in particular corporate tax avoidance, legal avoidance, makes governments unwilling. Wow. They don't dare to increase taxes even when that would be the right economic policy, because it's avoided. But this is a perfectly solvable problem. And as we see from the current efforts to reform international corporate taxation, what it took was for a couple of countries, in particular France, to say, actually, we're just going to tax these companies through a turnover tax, unless everybody else agrees to reform the system. That's how you do it. You just need the political will.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, our time is unfortunately up, but let me also give Mr. Lambert and Ms. Bertoluzzi for some final remarks, if you wish.
Well, I think I spoke enough, and I totally agree with what Martin just said.
Okay. Then a very last question to Santina. Scott Marcus, my colleague, asked a particular question, namely saying that there was a political agreement in last year at the council level to protect non-standard forms of employment, and apparently there is not much action there. So can you just very briefly, in a few sentences, elaborate what are the current efforts to protect non-standard employment?
Yeah. Well, first, I agree 100% on taxation. So I wanted to highlight this, and I think that here there is a battle that we really have to fight thoroughly and seriously, and we count on also on the Parliament to continue the fight for fair taxation. About atypical works or atypical contracts. You know what we have, there are two particularly important recommendations. One particularly important recommendation about social protection, which has been adopted in 2019. And then there is the directive on transparent and predictable working conditions, which has to enter into force. But as we have seen already right now with the introduction of short-time work schemes or similar schemes, it's a challenge for the member states to adapt, because as we said, the social protection system to the new the new jobs, the new forms of jobs, which do not correspond to the structure and the approach on which the social protection was built. So they are not open-ended contracts, they are not the ordinary kind of contracts. And the very good hook that we have is that several member states, based on also on the support of the Commission with the first decree package and now also SURE, have put into place schemes to cover atypical workers and also the self-employed, because we know that a large part of the so-called self-employed are bogus self-employed. And here we have an occasions to really use these opportunities to see how social protection system can adapt and need to be adapted to atypical works. Now, what is the remit of and I do not speak on behalf of the Commission, but what is the remit of the Commission here, and what we need to do to push member states? Well, we have adopted, as I said, recommendations for the modernization of a social protection system, and these has to be implemented by member states. What we use is the semester, and you might have seen that the recent cycle of the semester in 2020 has really focused also on key issues related to inequalities and also atypical workers. Several member states have got specific recommendation, country-specific recommendation to tackle the issues of atypical work. I'm thinking about Spain, for instance, where there is an ongoing debate on the reform of the labor market. And here we know very well that the power of the Commission is limited, but our intention is to really push in this sense. And really, we are very committed to implement, in this sense, also all the three big chapters of the social pillar. The proposal on minimum wage will come. It's the second phase of second consultation is ending tomorrow, because we have to respect the treaties provisions, and the social partners had the two-stage consultation foreseen. There will be a proposal on minimum wage, and these will be a concrete proposal. Concrete proposal is there also to answer to Philippe on the youth, because youth, for instance, are those who are most exposed to a typical kind of contracts before getting, and sometimes we talk about it's about sheer undeclared work. It's not even sometimes it's undeclared work. This is still very, very present in several regions of the European Union, and for instance, there is we are monitoring also through a dedicated platform the developments in a certain member state. But you know very well it is about the open method of coordination, and we have the recommendations now. What is interesting is that how is the challenge of integrating the recommendations, what is that we used to have with the semester, into the new facility for recovery and resilience. And here is the challenge, because now we have recommendations and we have the money, and the approach that we need to take here has not to be business as usual. We need to use the recommendations, and those are relevant to create resilience and inclusive growth, because there is an issue of, even when we have growth, and recently the marginal growth we have experienced after the financial crisis has proved that it was not inclusive. So that's an issue. That's why the sense of fairness is there. And that's why now, when we put in place the governance structure, and when we put in place national plans in order to use these funds and operationalize them, we need to use those recommendations at their maximum potential. But this is a common effort. The Commission, even in its best effort, cannot go far if the member states do not play the same game. And I think that there is now the momentum that it was not there before, for reasons which are sad reasons, but the momentum is there, and we cannot miss this moment. We really cannot miss this moment, because if we miss it, we will not have a second one. Because, as I said, all these the social injustice is really fueling total mistrust and at national level and European level. So this test is not the one that we have, and we can then try a second one if it fails. If it fails now, we will put into danger the European project itself, and we have an opportunity which is very valuable, that I think is unique in our history.
Thank you so much. Now, let us close this discussion with this somewhat positive note, that there is a momentum now, a lot of discussion. I mean, the Commission is making many new proposals. the Parliament is discussing and acting, and thought leaders like Martin are writing a lot about it and stimulating the debate. I think we can agree that inequality is a crucial issue in Europe. A lot needs to be done. So with these remarks, let me close this discussion and thank all three of you for this very excellent discussion. I think we could have continued for hours and hours, but unfortunately my time is up. And let me also thank our audience for participating in the poll, asking questions and following us. And there are still many other interesting sessions are coming up later in Bruegel annual meetings. So please stay with us for the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Thank you.